What happened when the Aussie SAS used bows and arrows in Vietnam? And why was the U.S. Army left speechless? This breakdown covers one of the most bizarre weapon stories from the Vietnam War, based on declassified mission reports, massive SOG records, and veteran testimonies that most military histories ignore. Between 1968 and 1970, Australian SAS operators and U.S. Special Forces teams recorded 67 confirmed crossbow kills in Cambodia. Not hunting accidents, combat kills, against enemy soldiers who never heard the shot coming. Staff Sergeant Robert Graham stood up in a firefight with his 55-pound hunting bow when his ammo ran low. The Viet Cong called the Australian SAS Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle, partly because of weapons like these. These weren't desperate last resorts or Hollywood stunts. They were calculated tactical decisions by elite operators who understood something about jungle warfare that the textbooks missed. If you're a veteran watching this, you probably understand why silence mattered more than firepower in that war. For everyone else, this is the unvarnished truth about medieval weapons in a modern conflict. If you value unvarnished military truth, subscribe. Check the description for full sourcing. Chapter 1 opens in the humid darkness of Cambodia's Fishhook region, 50 miles northwest of Saigon, where the official rules of warfare were about to collide with jungle reality. Mac VSOG Recon Team. PIC moved through the Triple Canopy in March 1969, 5 men carrying enough firepower to level a small village, CAR-15 assault rifles, M79 grenade launchers, Claymore mines, and enough ammunition to fight their way through hell itself. But Staff Sergeant Robert Graham, the team's 1-0 leader, carried something else strapped to his rucksack that would have made Pentagon planners question his sanity. A 55-pound hunting bow with razor-sharp broadhead arrows, mailed to him from home like some medieval care package. The Army Field Manual said nothing about personal archery equipment in combat zones. Standard operating procedure called for suppressed firearms, fragmentation grenades, and coordinated fire support when things went sideways. What the manual didn't account for was what happened when a 5-man reconnaissance team found itself pinned down by automatic weapons fire in a bomb crater, ammunition running dangerously low, and no helicopter extraction possible until the enemy guns stopped chattering. Graham's teammates watched in disbelief as their leader stood up in the middle of a firefight, drew back his hunting bow, and started loosing arrows into the muzzle flashes that had been keeping them pinned down for the better part of an hour. The enemy fire stopped. Not gradually, not after a long firefight, but abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was so complete that Graham's radio operator later said he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the crater walls. Within minutes, a green Hornet Huey was inbound for extraction, and 5 very confused Special Forces operators were climbing aboard with a story that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Graham himself would later joke that, somewhere in Hanoi, North Vietnamese veterans were probably still telling bar stories about the lunatic American who jumped up in a firefight and shot arrows at them like some deranged Robin Hood. But Graham wasn't the only operator experimenting with medieval solutions to modern problems. Across the border in Vietnam proper, Australian SAS patrols were earning their Vietnamese nickname Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, through tactics that emphasized absolute silence over overwhelming firepower. Between 1966 and 1971, nearly 1,200 SAS patrols moved through Phuoc Tuy province and beyond, compiling statistics that read like something out of a military fantasy novel. 492 confirmed enemy kills, 106 possibles, 47 wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses during those same 6 years totaled just 6 dead from all causes, including accidents and illness, with 28 wounded. Numbers like that didn't happen by accident, and they certainly didn't happen by following conventional infantry tactics. The SAS approach to jungle warfare was built on a simple principle that ran counter to everything American forces had been taught about Vietnam. Instead of using massive firepower to announce their presence and overwhelm the enemy, Australian reconnaissance teams moved like ghosts, watched enemy units for days without engaging, and struck only when they could guarantee devastating results with minimal risk to themselves. Their standard ambush lasted 15 to 20 seconds of absolutely murderous fire from Claymore mines and automatic weapons, followed by immediate withdrawal before the enemy could organize a counterattack. It was surgical, It was brutal, and it required weapons and tactics that conventional military thinking hadn't anticipated. This is where the crossbows entered the picture, not as Hollywood theatrics, but as practical solutions to tactical problems that standard infantry weapons couldn't solve. MACV-SOG mission reports from 1968 to 1970 document 67 confirmed crossbow kills in Cambodia alone, most of them during Operation Daniel Boone and Prairie Fire cross-border reconnaissance missions. These weren't desperate last resorts or psychological warfare stunts. They were calculated decisions made by operators who understood that in the jungle, the weapon that made no sound often proved more valuable than the one that fired the biggest bullet. The crossbows themselves came from two primary sources. CIA and Special Forces units had access to modern silent kill crossbows, purpose-built weapons designed for eliminating sentries and guard dogs without alerting nearby enemy forces. But many operators preferred the traditional Montagnard designs, crossbows, crafted from tropical timber and bamboo with fiber strings that had been killing silently in the Central Highlands for centuries before American boots ever touched Vietnamese soil. The Australian War Memorial still displays one of these indigenous crossbows, officially described as being used for hunting and clandestine activities during the Vietnam conflict. The diplomatic language can't hide what every operator who carried one understood perfectly well. In the dense jungle where a suppressed rifle shot could still echo for miles and a muzzle flash could give away your position to enemy forces you never saw coming, a crossbow bolt killed just as dead as a 5.56mm round, but left the enemy wondering what the hell had just happened. American soldiers, seeing Australian SAS operators board helicopters with bows and crossbows alongside their standard infantry weapons, initially reacted with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The jokes about Robin Hood and cowboys and Indians lasted right up until those same Americans heard the kill ratios and mission success rates that the crazy Aussies were achieving in areas where conventional American units were taking heavy casualties just trying to make contact with the enemy. The weight of war in Vietnam wasn't just measured in casualties or territory gained and lost. It was measured in pounds carried on the backs of 18- and 19-year-old soldiers humping through jungle so thick that noon looked like twilight. Every piece of equipment represented a trade-off between capability and mobility, between firepower and endurance, between what the field manuals said you needed and what you could actually carry through 10 days of continuous patrol without breaking down. For Australian SAS operators and American Special Forces teams operating in small reconnaissance units, these calculations became matters of life and death with every item that went into the rucksack. The M60 machine gun epitomized this brutal arithmetic of jungle warfare. Officially designated as the Standard Platoon Automatic Weapon, the M60 weighed 23 pounds unloaded and required a dedicated gunner, plus an assistant gunner to manage the weapon, its ammunition, and its spare parts during extended operations. American infantry doctrine treated the M60 as the cornerstone of small unit tactics, the weapon that provided sustained suppressive fire and area denial against enemy forces. But doctrine written in air-conditioned offices at Fort Benning didn't account for the reality of carrying that much weight through elephant grass and triple canopy forest, where visibility was measured in yards and contact with the enemy happened at ranges where a pistol was as effective as a rifle. SAS patrols operating on their own in enemy-controlled territory faced a different set of priorities. 6-man teams inserted by helicopter or on foot had to carry everything they needed for missions lasting 7 to 10 days, including food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment, and enough firepower to break contact with enemy forces that might outnumber them 50 to 1. Every pound mattered when you were operating without resupply or reinforcement, and every sound you made could bring down an entire North Vietnamese regiment on your position. Some SAS patrols carried a single M60 or a modified full-automatic SLR as a break contact weapon, but others went without belt-fed machine guns entirely, trusting their ability to avoid detection over their capacity to win a sustained firefight. The ANPRC-25 radio represented another perfect example of the weight penalty that came with modern military capability. General Crichton Abrams called the PRC-25 the most important tactical field item in Vietnam, and he wasn't wrong. The ability to call for artillery support, Airstrikes or helicopter extraction could mean the difference between a successful mission and a missing patrol that never came home. But that capability came at a cost of £25 for the radio itself, plus another £4.50 for each spare battery. The radio man also carried the most conspicuous piece of equipment on the patrol, with a long whip antenna that snagged on every branch and vine, metal components that clinked against webbing and equipment, and electronic noise that could be detected by enemy direction-finding equipment. Australian operators who had grown up hunting in the bush understood something that many American soldiers never quite grasped about the relationship between noise and survival in hostile territory. Every piece of metal equipment created sound signatures that carried farther in the jungle than most people realized. Belt-fed machine guns rattled and clanked with every movement. Radio harnesses squeaked and clicked against load-bearing equipment. Even suppressed weapons made mechanical noise as the bolts cycled and brass cases hit the ground. For patrols whose primary mission was reconnaissance and intelligence gathering rather than direct action, the ability to move through enemy territory without creating any sound at all often proved more valuable than the heaviest firepower. This is where weapons like crossbows began to make tactical sense to operators who had initially dismissed them as primitive anachronisms. A traditional Montagnard crossbow weighed maybe 4 to 6 pounds total, produced no electronic signature, required no batteries or spare parts, and killed in absolute silence at ranges up to 50 meters. More importantly, crossbow bolts could be recovered and reused, unlike ammunition that was gone forever once fired. For teams operating beyond the reach of resupply, that kind of sustainability mattered in ways that peacetime training had never anticipated. The Australian L1A1 SLR represented the opposite extreme of the weight and noise equation. Officially a semi-automatic 7.62 NATO battle rifle designed for disciplined marksmanship, at extended ranges, the SLR weighed nearly 11 pounds loaded and fired a full-power cartridge that could penetrate light cover and body armor at 300 meters. But SAS armorers and operators had their own ideas about how the weapon should perform in jungle combat. Working with parts from the fully automatic L2A1 variant, they created shortened, full-auto monsters that Australian troops nicknamed the Bitch or Slaughtermatic. These field-modified weapons featured cut-down barrels, 30-round magazines, and select fire capability that could dump an entire magazine in less than 3 seconds. The result was a weapon that perfectly embodied the SAS approach to jungle warfare. When stealth failed and a patrol was compromised, the modified SLR could generate enough firepower to smash through an encircling enemy force and create an escape route to an extraction point. But the same weapon that could save your life in a firefight would also give away your position to every enemy soldier within a mile radius. The muzzle blast was described by veterans as obscenely loud. The muzzle flash lit up the jungle like a strobe light, and the recoil made accurate fire nearly impossible beyond the first few rounds. It was a weapon designed for one specific tactical situation, the moment when hiding was no longer an option and violence was the only way home. The jungle itself was the most dangerous enemy that American and Australian forces faced in Vietnam, not because of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers who used it for concealment, but because of the way it transformed every aspect of modern warfare into something that military academies and training centers had never adequately prepared soldiers to handle. Sound behaved differently under triple canopy forest, where humidity hung in the air like a physical presence, and every leaf and branch created acoustic shadows that could hide or reveal a patrol's position in ways that defied conventional understanding. The threats that killed soldiers in the Vietnamese bush were often invisible until the moment they struck, and the weapons that looked most impressive on the parade ground frequently proved least effective when lives depended on them. Suppressed weapons represented one of the most frustrating examples of technology that promised more than it could deliver in jungle conditions. American Special Forces and MACV-SOG teams carried suppressed CAR-15 rifles and pistols specifically designed for the kind of close-range stealth operations that reconnaissance and prisoner snatch missions required. Military contractors and ordnance specialists had spent millions of dollars developing suppressors, subsonic ammunition, and specialized sighting systems that were supposed to give American forces a decisive advantage in night operations and sentry elimination missions. But the physics of supersonic bullets and mechanical firearm actions created problems that no amount of engineering could completely solve. Even the best suppressors could only reduce the sound signature of a gunshot, not eliminate it entirely. A 5.56mm round traveling at over 3,000 feet per second created a sonic crack that could be heard for hundreds of yards, forcing operators to use subsonic ammunition that significantly reduced both range and stopping power. The mechanical action of the rifle still produced audible clicks and clatters as the bolt cycled, spent cases ejected, and the firing pin struck the primer. More critically, suppressors heated up rapidly during sustained use, causing point of impact to shift unpredictably and creating thermal signatures that could be detected by enemy forces equipped with night vision devices. Veteran operators discovered through hard experience that truly silent killing at close range required weapons that produced no mechanical noise, no muzzle blast, no ejected cases, and no electronic signature that could be detected by increasingly sophisticated enemy surveillance equipment. A crossbow bolt fired from a traditional Montagnard weapon killed just as effectively as a rifle bullet at ranges under 30 meters, but left the enemy with no audible indication of where the shot had originated or what weapon had been used. The psychological impact on surviving enemy soldiers who discovered bodies with arrow wounds but heard no gunfire could be as valuable as the tactical advantage of remaining undetected. Guard dogs represented another tactical challenge that conventional weapons training had never adequately addressed. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units increasingly relied on dogs to detect American and Australian patrols moving through areas that human sentries couldn't adequately cover. A single bark could alert an entire base camp or trail junction to the presence of enemy forces, turning a reconnaissance mission into a running firefight that reconnaissance teams were never equipped to sustain. Even suppressed firearms created enough noise to potentially trigger barking from other dogs in the area, creating a cascade of alarm calls that could compromise missions before they properly began. MAC-VSOG teams discovered that crossbows offered the most reliable solution for neutralizing guard dogs without alerting human sentries. Mission reports from Cambodia document numerous instances where reconnaissance teams used crossbow bolts to eliminate guard dogs at trail junctions and supply caches, allowing patrols to continue their missions without detection. The silence was absolute, the killing was instantaneous, and there was no risk of ricochet or overpenetration that might wound the animal without killing it immediately. Veterans described crossbows as dog silencers, tools that solved a specific tactical problem that no conventional weapon could address as effectively. Booby traps and early warning devices created another category of hidden threats that shaped how elite units approached movement and engagement in enemy territory. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese engineers had developed increasingly sophisticated networks of tripwires, punji stakes, explosive devices, and alarm systems that could detect and engage enemy patrols without requiring direct human intervention. Conventional infantry units accepted mine and booby trap casualties as an unavoidable cost of operating in contested areas, but reconnaissance teams couldn't afford those losses. A single wounded man could compromise an entire mission, and evacuation procedures that worked for large infantry formations were impossible for six-man patrols operating 50 miles behind enemy lines. Australian SAS patrols developed movement techniques that emphasized absolute control over every footstep, every hand placement, and every piece of equipment that might create noise or trigger detection systems. Their extraordinary casualty ratios reflected not just superior training and equipment, but a fundamental understanding that avoiding contact was often more important than winning firefights. SAS teams would observe enemy positions for days before engaging, studying patrol patterns, guard rotations, and supply schedules until they could predict exactly when and where to strike for maximum effect with minimum risk to themselves. The nickname Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, that Vietnamese forces gave to Australian SAS units reflected not just their stealth capabilities, but the psychological impact of facing an enemy that could kill without warning and disappear without trace. Vietnamese veterans of encounters with SAS patrols described the terror of discovering that entire squads had been wiped out in ambushes that lasted less than 20 seconds, leaving no survivors and no clear indication of where the attackers had come from or where they had gone. The combination of claymore mines, automatic weapons, and immediate withdrawal created a level of violence that was both overwhelming and precisely controlled. Surgical strikes that left enemy forces afraid to move along established trails and supply routes. The weapons that armies carried into Vietnam represented decades of military thinking that had been shaped by two world wars and the Korean conflict. Conflicts fought primarily in open terrain, where long-range marksmanship and sustained automatic fire determined the outcome of most engagements. But the dense jungles of Southeast Asia created tactical conditions that made many of these carefully developed weapon systems seem like relics from a different kind of war entirely. Soldiers found themselves carrying rifles designed for 500-meter engagements into a combat environment, where most firefights happened at ranges under 50 meters, where visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, and where the weight of ammunition often mattered more than its ballistic performance. The Owen submachine gun epitomized this disconnect between weapon design and battlefield reality. Australian forces had carried Owen guns through the Pacific Campaign of World War II, where the weapon's reputation for reliability in tropical conditions and its resistance to mud and sand had made it a favorite among infantry units operating in some of the harshest environments on Earth. By the time Australian forces deployed to Vietnam in the 1960s, the Owen was already 20 years old, a weapon from an earlier technological generation that looked primitive compared to the sleek assault rifles and advanced fire control systems that other NATO forces were adopting. But obsolescence was a relative concept in jungle warfare. The Owen's top-feeding magazine system and simple blowback operation made it nearly impossible to jam, even after days of exposure to the humidity and vegetation debris that disabled more sophisticated weapons. At 9.5 pounds loaded with a 33-round magazine, the Owen was heavy for a pistol-caliber weapon, but that weight helped control the rapid rate of fire that made submachine guns effective in close-quarters battle. The problem wasn't reliability or controllability, it was the fundamental limitation of the 9mm cartridge in a combat environment where bullets had to penetrate thick jungle vegetation, load-bearing equipment, and improvised cover before reaching their targets. Australian infantry discovered through bitter experience that pistol-caliber ammunition lacked the penetration and stopping power needed for jungle combat. Enemy soldiers wearing even basic web gear and equipment could absorb multiple 9mm hits and continue fighting, while the relatively low velocity of pistol ammunition meant that even light brush and foliage could deflect bullets enough to cause misses at ranges where a rifle should guarantee hits. The Owen remained popular with rear-area personnel and special operations units who valued its compact size and reliability, but frontline infantry increasingly preferred weapons that fired full-power rifle cartridges. The M14 rifle and its Commonwealth equivalent, the L1A1 SLR, represented the opposite extreme of this caliber debate. Both weapons fired the full-power 7.62 NATO cartridge, a round that could punch through light cover and body armor at ranges exceeding 300 meters. Military planners who had studied the lessons of Korea believed that future conflicts would require accurate long-range fire and the ability to engage targets at distances where earlier weapons had proved inadequate. The M14 and SLR were designed to give individual riflemen the capability to engage targets at ranges that had previously required crew-served weapons or specialized marksmen, but jungle warfare turned these advantages into liabilities. The M14 weighed over 10 pounds loaded, significantly heavier than the M16 that eventually replaced it in American service. More importantly, the weapon's length of nearly 45 inches made it unwieldy in dense vegetation, where soldiers often had to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. The powerful 7.62 cartridge that was supposed to provide superior penetration and stopping power also produced much more recoil than soldiers could effectively control during rapid fire, especially when shooting from unstable positions or while moving through difficult terrain. American troops who had trained with the M14 on open firing ranges discovered that its theoretical advantages disappeared in close-quarters jungle combat, where speed and maneuverability often mattered more than long-range precision. Australian forces retained the L1A1 SLR throughout their involvement in Vietnam, accepting the weapon's weight and bulk as necessary trade-offs for reliability and stopping power. But even Australian infantry recognized that the SLR was imperfectly suited to the tactical conditions they faced in Phuoc Tuy province and the surrounding areas. The weapon's semi-automatic fire mode reflected a military philosophy that emphasized accurate, disciplined shooting over the rapid suppressive fire that jungle combat often required. SAS units and other special operations forces modified their SLRs extensively, converting them to full automatic fire and shortening the barrels to create weapons that bore little resemblance to the original design. These field modifications created weapons that military inspectors would have rejected as unsafe and unreliable, but that proved devastatingly effective in the specific tactical situations where elite units employed them. The shortened, full-automatic SLR that Australian troops nicknamed the Bitch could dump an entire 30-round magazine in seconds, creating enough firepower to break contact with superior enemy forces and allowing small patrols to fight their way out of ambushes that would have destroyed conventional infantry units. The weapon was impossibly loud, uncontrollable in sustained fire, and completely unsuited to the precision marksmanship role that the original SLR had been designed to fulfill. But it solved the tactical problem of generating overwhelming firepower from a weapon that one man could carry and employ without assistance. The contrast between these heavy, loud, mechanically complex weapons and the simple effectiveness of traditional crossbows highlighted a fundamental truth about jungle warfare that military academies and weapons development programs had consistently failed to understand. In dense vegetation, where most engagements happened at ranges under 30 meters, the weapon that killed silently and reliably often proved more valuable than the one that fired the most powerful cartridge or cycled at the highest rate. A Montagnard crossbow that weighed 4 pounds and made no noise could accomplish tactical missions that a 20-pound machine gun could not, simply because stealth and surprise often mattered more than raw firepower in an environment where detection usually meant death for small reconnaissance teams. The psychological dimension of warfare in Vietnam extended far beyond the traditional metrics of killed and wounded, territory gained and lost, or missions accomplished and failed. It encompassed the deeper terror of facing an enemy that could strike without warning and vanish without trace, leaving survivors to wonder what had just happened and whether it might happen again. For Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces operating in areas where Australian SAS and American Special Forces teams conducted reconnaissance and direct action missions, this psychological warfare became a constant presence that affected every aspect of their daily operations and long-term morale. The nickname Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, that Vietnamese forces gave to Australian SAS units reflected not just respect for their tactical capabilities, but genuine fear of an enemy that seemed to operate by different rules than conventional military forces. Vietnamese veterans of encounters with SAS patrols described discovering entire squads that had been wiped out in ambushes lasting less than 20 seconds, with no survivors to explain what had happened or where the attackers had come from. The bodies were often found days later, arranged in positions that suggested they had been caught completely by surprise, sometimes with wounds that indicated they had been killed by weapons that made no sound when fired. This is where the psychological impact of silent weapons became as important as their tactical effectiveness. A crossbow bolt or arrow that killed without creating any audible report left enemy forces with no indication of the direction of attack, the number of attackers, or the type of weapons being used against them. Surviving enemy soldiers who discovered bodies with arrow wounds but heard no gunfire were forced to confront the possibility that they were facing an enemy that could kill them from close range without their knowledge, a realization that created fear levels far beyond what conventional firearms could achieve. The fear was compounded by the fact that these silent killings often occurred in areas that enemy forces considered secure, base camps and supply staging areas where soldiers should have been able to relax their guard and recover from the stress of combat operations. Macy VSOG teams and attached Australian operators deliberately targeted these secure areas, using crossbows and traditional weapons to eliminate sentries and guard dogs in ways that left the remaining enemy forces unsure whether they were dealing with skilled human opponents or something supernatural that defied their understanding of how warfare was supposed to work. The contrast between this invisible, silent threat and the overwhelming firepower that characterized most American military operations in Vietnam created a unique form of psychological pressure that Vietnamese forces struggled to comprehend and counter. They had learned to deal with artillery bombardments, airstrikes, and frontal assaults by large infantry formations, developing tactics and fortifications that could minimize casualties from these predictable forms of attack. But they had no effective defense against small teams of elite operators who could infiltrate their positions, kill key personnel without alerting nearby troops, and disappear before any organized response could be mounted. For American and Australian soldiers who witnessed or participated in these operations, the psychological impact was equally profound but took different forms. Conventional troops who saw special forces or SAS operators boarding helicopters with bows and crossbows alongside their standard military weapons initially reacted with amusement and disbelief. The jokes about Robin Hood and medieval warfare seemed natural and harmless, a way of dealing with the absurdity of mixing ancient and modern weapons in a technological conflict that featured helicopter gunships, jet aircraft, and electronic surveillance systems. But the humor disappeared when those same conventional troops learned about the kill ratios and mission success rates that special operations units were achieving in areas where regular infantry formations were taking heavy casualties just trying to make contact with the enemy. The realization that these primitive weapons were contributing to tactical successes that conventional forces couldn't match forced many soldiers to reconsider their assumptions about what constituted effective military equipment and tactics in jungle warfare. The moral and psychological weight of using silent weapons for close-range killing created long-term impacts that many veterans found difficult to discuss, even decades after the war ended. Killing at ranges of 20 to 30 meters with a crossbow bolt or broadhead arrow created memories that were sharper and more personal than firing bursts from automatic weapons at muzzle flashes in the distance. The intimacy of silent killing, where operators could see their targets clearly and had to make conscious decisions about when and how to strike, left psychological scars that differed from those created by conventional combat experiences. Some veterans found a strange sense of professional satisfaction in the precision and control that silent weapons required. There were no wasted rounds, no collateral casualties, no artillery strikes that might kill unintended targets. Each shot was deliberate, necessary, and immediately effective. The crossbow or bow demanded a level of skill and judgment that automatic weapons did not, creating a sense of craftsmanship and personal responsibility that some operators found preferable to the impersonal violence of modern military technology. Other veterans discovered that the same precision and intimacy made the memories more vivid and harder to suppress during the years after they returned home. The faces of enemy soldiers killed with arrows remained, clearer in memory than those killed with rifles or machine guns. The silence that had been tactically advantageous during combat became psychologically troubling in civilian life, when former operators found themselves unable to forget specific moments of violence that had no accompanying sound to blur the details. The ultimate nightmare for both sides was the realization that warfare in Vietnam had devolved into a level of personal, intimate violence that modern military training and doctrine had never adequately prepared soldiers to handle or recover from. The bows and crossbows were symbols of this devolution, weapons that forced operators and their enemies to confront the fundamental reality of combat, stripped of technological buffers and reduced to its most basic elements.